Hello everyone, welcome to this video. In this video I'm going to show you this application, very simple application that I built. It's called a counter application. I'm going to show you the features and how it looks like so that you can use that concept or that knowledge to build your own application or similar application. So this is a little bit different from the usual counter application that you've seen around. So you can do the counting backward and forward, and then you could also see that there is this icon here which lets you set some options, right? Okay, so we will come to that in a second. But one thing you can do though is add more counters like this, right? So you can have something like staff meeting attendance, and then this could be males, this could be females, right? So more like you can have a group of counters and you can keep adding as many counters as you want. And this one also lets you add more counters, like more group of counters like this here, and you can also add more counters here. So one thing you can do is set the options. So there is this negative value which is unchecked, meaning you can't actually count into the negative values. So when you reach 0, you mean like you click on it, you can't continue counting forward, right? But then when I check it, I can now start counting into the negatives, right? So it means you want to allow negative values. So depending on what you're doing, you can allow negative values or not. And then this one, when you set a limit, probably if you have a limit you want to hit or you don't want to go beyond, you can just set the limit for the counter. So let me say the limit is going to be maybe 10. I can even say 20. And then we have this increment by, at the moment it's 1, so it's increasing it by 1 or decreasing it by 1, right? And then the limit is 20, so when I get to 20 I won't be able to continue counting. It's just gonna stop, right? And when you set the increment bar to maybe 2, then it means that when you count it's gonna increase it by 2. So basically that's the concept. You can add more options like delete, duplicate, or maybe even change the color of these labels. I plan of doing that, but up until this point I've not implemented that. So you guys can have access to this code or probably write your own code from scratch and add more options. I'm going to take you through the code, and hopefully you would be able to learn something from it and use it in your project. I created the project using create react app. So if you want to start from scratch, you can do npx create react app, and then you give your application a name. In this case I called it m counter, which basically mean multi counter or multiple counter, whatever. When you come here, you'd see that I have a couple of components. I'll come to that in a second. But one thing I want to show you is the packages I used. So when you check, I used Bootstrap for the styling. I also plan of using React colors to change the colors of the labels, but I've not implemented that yet. And then the last thing I used is this UUID, which is used to generate unique IDs, right? I also use Font Awesome icons for React. So I have these 3 packages here: Font Awesome, SVG Core, SVG Icons, and React Font Awesome. Right? So I'll show you how I used that in the project in a second. So when I open app.js, you'd see that I'm using React Context API. Right, yeah, so I've created this counter context provider. I'm using the app context dot provider and then the values which I'm passing the state. And you would also notice that I use useReducer hook, which you're going to know about in a second. And then I am also using the useContext hook to be able to access the state. Right, yeah, so basically this is more like the structure of the state that I'm going to be using to show you guys. We have this default metadata which is showing the label, the allow negative value which is by default false, the limits which is this high number, increments bar which is by default 1, and then we have list of counters in that particular group, right, just like what I showed you. So this is the group and this is the counters. We have the actual counters we have in the group. By default we have one counter in it. When you create a new counter, we just have one in it. I'm also creating this object separately here, and that counter is also having a value which is the value that displays here. It's having the label, that is the label here. So the first label is for the group and then the second one is for the actual counter, and then the label color which I'm not using at the moment. So yeah, I can actually remove that from here. Let me take you through the components that I used. So when I open the components folder, you'd see that I have the header component here, which I'm calling header.js. That is the blue bar at the top here. And then I'm also having the counter options component, which is showing these options, right? Yeah, when I click on the icon here. And then I have the counter group. So the counter group is actually the parent of the actual counters, right? And then I also have the counter app, which is more like the parent component hosting the counter group, and then the counter options, and then the actual counter. Yeah, so when I open the counter app, you'd see that it's using the counter group here. In the app.js, this is where it started. I created this counter provider which is using the app context. So if I show you the context, it was created here. This is all what it contains. So I am initializing the application context using react.createContext, right? Yeah, and that's all what you need to do. So I do app context.provider, which means that I can now provide whatever is in the context to like all the children components. I'm passing the value here, which is the data, and then the actions I can perform. The data is coming from here. It's having this default new metadata group, which is this, right? So it means that a group is having these options, and then you can have a lot of counters here. The reason why I made the state like this is for me to be able to easily access it. You can use something like a list, so you can have a list containing a lot of groups, and on the counters too, you can have a list of objects containing all the counters in them. Yeah, but I want to keep it as object so that I can, whichever counter group that I am accessing, I can just do the state dot the ID of the counter group, which in this case is the unique ID the UUID is generating for us, right? Yeah, so I'm storing the groups with the ID. So if I show you in the developer tools, I'll do app counter and then the value which is having the data. You'd see the structure of the data like that, right? So we have the ID, and then when I drill down, you'd see that we have the counters on it, and then we have all the options here, right? So if I want to access a particular counter group or counter, I can just do the name of the state, that is data dot. If I have the ID, then I do dot ID, and then it's going to give me all the data we have on that group. And if I want to access a particular counter, I can just do the data dot ID dot counters and then dot the name of the counter, right? Yeah, so just an object and be doing dot dot on it to access it. Yeah, instead of actually having an array and iterating through the array to access the data or the particular data. Yeah, I just want to avoid the looping in this case, but yeah, whichever way you use to store your data is fine. So this actually gives you a nice view of how the structure of your context, how your application structure looks like, right? So I'll close it down at the moment and then yeah, go back, remove this. So by default it's gonna have just one counter with one group with one counter in it, and you can add the rest with the buttons. You realize that with the state I am using the useReducer hook, which means that I am using a reducer, which is this counter reducer, to manage my state. So if I control click that counter reducer, which is this, now this is where I am managing my state, right? So I have the state and then the action to actually manipulate the state. You would see that I am doing this dot dot here, which basically means that I am spreading everything in the states and probably adding the one I have modified, right? Yeah, so I'm doing it this way to avoid state mutation. That is, I don't want to modify the state directly, because if you do that you're gonna have problems with React basically. But it's based on the action you are performing. It looks into the state and modifies the state based on the action you are performing. So in this case, if you are doing an increment, which is like if you are clicking on this button to increase the number, it basically looks at the group using the group ID, and then it's going to call this function. Now I created a separate function for it because I have the same kind of structure for all these four stuff, doing the same thing. The only thing that changes is the action type, right? Yeah, so I created a function and then yeah, I'm actually using the action type to modify the state, right? So in this case, if I want to increment it, then I am going to do the value and then I would use the increment by value to increase the value in the state. When I make the code available to you, you can actually look at this a little bit to try and then understand what I am doing here. But basically, yeah, I am getting the counter states, which is actually what I am passing here. So in this case, the counter state is coming from here, right? Yeah, the previous counter state which I'm getting here using, as I told you, the group dot counters dot payload dot id, right? So it's just going to locate that particular object on the counters using the ID of that particular counter. Yeah, and that's what I was showing you here. It's using the ID as a key and then the data which is coming from here. So up until this point, I hope you understand the structure of my state and yeah, how I am actually modifying the state and returning a new state with the modified value, right, using the object spreading. So this function is being called here so that it will target that particular group and then modify the particular counter I want to modify on the counters, on the list of counters, right? Yeah, so I want to return everything in the group and then only change the counter item that I want to change using the ID. That's what is happening down here. So basically that's all what the reducer is doing. So if I am decreasing the value. It's doing basically the same thing, just checking that the action coming is decrement. So if it is decrement, it's going to just subtract using the increment by value, right? And then it's going to modify only the counter, the particular counter, the value of that particular counter that I want to modify, yeah, by targeting this value, and then spreading it, making sure that it retained everything else in the group, and then also add the modified counter value. So when you do it this way, you're not gonna get problems in React, because React is going to get your updated value and re-render your component so that you get the changes on your UI as you see here. Yeah, and basically that's what I'm doing for all the other stuff. Here you'd see that these allow negative as options on the group, not on the counters, not on the specific counters. So I'm targeting the state, returning everything on the group, and then modifying only that particular property, that is negative value allowed, doing the spread here. So first I am spreading the state, returning everything in state. Now target that group with the group ID, return everything, and modify only this property. Right? And at the end of the day, it's going to return the state with the changed value. This counter reducer is going to receive a state and an action, and based on the action type, which I'm switching here, it's going to modify the states as it is supposed to do. So let me close this down and then come back to what the header is doing. So in the header, I am only printing the heading in H3, which is the counter, which is showing here, and then I am also rendering this add button, which is supposed to add a new group to it, right? So in this case, it is dispatching a data. Now you notice that this dispatch data is coming from the use context, that is the application context that I've created. The state is global because I'm using the context API, so I can now dispatch data or dispatch events from anywhere in the application to the state. Right, yeah, I don't have to pass properties down. So I'm dispatching a data with type add group, and then with this particular payload having the group ID, which is a new ID that I'm creating, and then a new group which is using the new group metadata, which is here, right? And you could see that I'm exporting the new group metadata here. So it's all the time going to initialize it with the new group metadata, and then it's going to generate a unique ID for it using the UUID, right? Yeah, and basically that is what happens when I click on this. Okay, so we go to the counter app now. Yeah, this is where I'm rendering the header component, and under there I am rendering the counter group components, right? Yeah, you'd also notice that I have this class name main container here, which is doing this kind of styling, and you could see all my styles in the app.css. Well, this application is not having a huge amount of styles, so I am putting everything in the app.css file, but you can go ahead and split it based on your components. I can now get the data here, that is the state that I have, and because I have it as an object, I want to be able to get all the various groups and then render a different component for it using the counter group component, right? So how we do that is using the object dot keys. So it's going to take the keys of the object. So when you do object dot keys data, it's going to, well, take all the keys of the object. In this case, the keys will be the group IDs, and then it's going to render them in this counter group component. right? And then you have to pass this key because React will actually hold your truth if you don't pass it. And then I want to get the group ID, and I also want to get the group, which is the actual group I am getting using the data dot group ID. But then because it's a variable I am getting, I have to use this angle brackets, right? Yeah, so it's more or less like doing object dot and then the property name. So that's what I'm doing here. Yeah, hopefully you understand that. So this component is now going to render all the different counter groups that we have. So in this case, yeah, like this. And then on this counter group, we have all the counters. So let's check out what happens in the counter group. So you would notice that the group ID is now being accessed here, and then the actual group is being accessed here. And on the group we have all these properties on it which we can use, and that is what I am actually using on the counter options here. I have this input here which is setting the label, which has been initialized to label, that is coming from the options. And then I have this button here to add new counters to the group, this particular one. And then now we have this ellipse icons to show the counter options. As in when I click on it, it shows this counter options, right? Yeah. And then on the counter options, when I go inside that particular component, you would see that we have the input. This input is handling the negative, allow negative values. That is a checkbox handling the allow negative values, as I showed you earlier. And then there's this one handling the limits, and then this particular one handling the increments by. So you can add a lot of options here and then implement it as such. Right. So this is the counter options component. When it comes here, we have the options on that particular component coming from the counter group. Right. So we have this options prop, which is coming from this counter options. So you can use the options there, and then you can also dispatch an event to change the options in the state, and that is what I am doing here. Right. Yeah, so basically handle negative value is going to dispatch an event to the state, and the type is allow negative value. The payload, it is basically targeting the group using the group ID, and then the negative value we want to allow. So if initially it is going to be false, so it's going to do the not the negative value allowed value, which initially is false, so it's going to be true. And if it is true, it's going to be false when it dispatches again. Yeah, hopefully you get that. And this is also setting the limits with the limit number, and I'm passing it as a number because when you get a value from an input field, it's come as a string, so you have to pass it as a number because we are using it as a number. And the same thing is happening for the increments by value, right? Yeah, so we pass the action type, which is the increments by, the payload, which is the group ID, then the increments by number. So if it is 1, increments by 1. If it is 2, increments by 2. Yeah, and basically that is what the onChange is doing for them, right? The onChange and then the value onChange is basically dispatching the events here. So that is all there is to it. Now you would notice that I have another property on this input, the increment by input, which is a minimum of 1, and it's basically letting you not go below 1 because you cannot increment by 0, right? So hopefully it makes sense, you understand it. If not, you can always put a comment in the comment section. So let's move forward. Now we focus on the counter itself. Here I'm also using the dispatch data because it's basically going to dispatch some events, some actions that we are going to be doing. Yeah, and then the first one we have here is the increment. We also have a decrement. We can dispatch an event to change the label, right? Yeah. So here you would see that here we add the group ID, the ID of the counter, the increment by value, and we are also using the previous value, so that based on the previous value we can increase it by the increment by value we have here. Yeah, and that is what we are basically doing here. Target the group ID, call this function. This function is going to target the counter, the particular counter, use the increment by value to increase it based on the previous value. That is what we are doing here. This changing the label, decrementing, incrementing, right? Yeah, basically, and this is where we are setting the label, the buttons to handle subtract and handle alt, that is increment and decrement, and we are also using the value here, right? Yeah. And one thing that I have to talk about is how I am using the font awesome icons. So the way you use it is you import the font awesome icon here, and then you also import the specific icons you want to use from font awesome free solid svg icons. So this font awesome component is what you use here, and you pass the icon as the icon you want to use, right? That's what we have here. So first the component, second the actual icon on this icon prop. Let me also talk about this use effect. Basically, this use effect is preventing the negative allowed value and then you going beyond the limits, right? So you'd notice that the dependencies I'm using for the use effects are all listed here because I'm using that inside here. So this is basically checking if negative value is not allowed. If it is not allowed, then it is going to dispatch an event. So when you go beyond 0, it's not going to allow you, it's going to all the time set it back to 0. But then when negative value is allowed, that is if your checkbox is true, then you can now go beyond 0. This function is not going to run. Alright, and this one is also checking for the limits. It checks if the limit, if the value is greater than the limit, then it's going to dispatch a value and then set your value to the limit, meaning you can't go beyond the limits here. Alright, yeah, there are a couple of things you can improve here when you look at it. Implementing the increments by and then the limits, there are a couple of things that can happen, but yeah, hopefully the idea is going to be the same. You just have to check and yeah, make your logic right. So hopefully you understand all the things that I'm talking about here. I know it's a bit abstract, but I'm going to make the code available for you so that you can actually have a look at it and use it yourself. But one thing I didn't talk about though is how I am rendering the counter component. Right, so you would notice that each group is having list of counters that can be accessed using the keys, that is the ID. And I'm doing the object.keys here, the same object.keys here, to loop through all the counters with the counter ID and passing these props, that is the group ID, the options, and then the actual counter. So that when you come into the counter, you have the ID, the options, and then the counter. The options is containing the group ID, so I think that I removed the group ID from here, but then I forgot to remove it from here, so it's no more receiving the group ID prop here. Okay, so in this case you have a component handling all the counters so that you don't get problems with changing the value for a particular counter and it changing for another one. And to mention again, I'm going to make the code available, so check the description for the source code. You can actually clone it or download it, use it, improve it, or probably look at the example, the way I'm implementing stuff, and use the knowledge to actually build your own stuff. Everything we went through is resulting to what we have here, right? Yeah, setting the values and all that. Thank you for watching this video. There are lots of interesting projects that I have on the way coming, so be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification icon so that whenever I post a new video, you get it first. Bye bye.